Order. Before we begin, I wish to make a short statement about the House's sub judice resolution. There are legal proceedings active in relation to the policy of applying VAT to private schools. However, Mr Speaker issued a waiver on the 5th of February to allow reference to these cases now and in future proceedings on the grounds of national importance. Just for the record, I also wish to point out that my daughter is a teacher in a school affected by the VAT on fees. Just for the record. I now call John Lamont to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Vickers. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 701268 relating to VAT on independent school fees and business rates relief for independent schools. The subject of the petition has gained over 114,000 signatures in 2 months, and whose lead petitioner, Hugh Beckinsale, joins us here today with his daughter Amelia, someone who will be directly impacted by this policy decision. This petition has a straightforward ask of the Government. Do not apply VAT to independent school fees or remove business rates relief. I want to begin by quickly noting the specific statements of the petition. It says that the Government needs to understand that not all independent school parents are wealthy, appreciate the benefits of independent schools and do better due diligence. The signees agreed, and I quote, "This policy will split children from established friend networks, familiar environments and place the burden and cost on public schools." Mr Vickers, I will build on these points throughout the debate, but these succinct statements get straight to the heart of this issue, and I commend the petition organisers on being so direct and clear. Now let me turn to my own view on this issue. This topic is divisive. Usually that would cause a government to approach it with caution, respect and careful deliberation. But this Labour government has taken the opposite approach. They have been deliberately divisive because their goal here is not to improve education for all or even some young people. This decision was taken for purely political and ideological reasons. It is a direct result of the politics of envy and bitterness that extreme elements of the Labour Party subscribe to and champion. It will do damage to young people directly and indirectly, but the government is not listening or even pretending to listen. In truth, Labour ministers do not care about the negative impact of this policy. They do not consider what may happen as a result of it. As the Independent Schools Council has made clear, independent schools were shocked at the rushed nature of the introduction of this policy. In my discussions with representatives of independent schools, they have said it has not been well thought through. Now, before I move on to look at the negative impact that this policy will have, I want to briefly mention my own constituency in the Scottish Borders. We are lucky to have excellent schools in both the state and independent sector across the Scottish Borders. St Mary's in Melrose is the only independent school located in my constituency. However, many of my constituents send their children to independent schools in Edinburgh, East Lothian and across the border to Longridge Towers near Berwick-upon-Tweed. St Mary's School was founded in 1895 and has been providing an extraordinary educational experience for boys and girls aged between 2 and 13 years old. All of these young people will be directly affected by this policy, so I have received many letters and emails from concerned parents and teachers. As a result of the lack of care when this policy was brought in, Labour have created serious issues which will impact pupils, parents and the public purse. Firstly, this policy will burden parents with huge costs when bills are already high and that when they have already been taxed on the money they earn, they will now be forced to pay tax on it again. As the Independent Schools Council have highlighted, this policy is and I quote, blanket tax that assumes independent schools are a stereotype. It assumes wrongly that all parents who send their children to independent schools are immensely wealthy and can afford to pay more and more. This was also noted by Matthew Dent, Public Affairs and Policy Officer at the Independent Schools Council. He highlighted that this policy treats everyone who sends children to independent schools as wealthy and that it is simply not realistic to raise taxes by 20% with no warning. It's a good point. There are very few other instances where the government would even consider a 20 percentage point tax rise in a single year. The second issue, Mr Vickers, is that Labour has created, is the impact on vulnerable pupils who seem to have been neglected entirely. There seems to be no recognition from the government that independent schools do not just cater exclusively for wealthy children, but for young people who may need extra support. As Independent Schools Council's Chief Executive, Julie Robertson, has said, this policy will cause huge disruption for thousands of families and children, especially those in low-fee faith schools, specialist arts education, single-sex schools, or those who need special needs support. Mr Vickers, the Scottish Council of Independent Schools has also endorsed this point. They said pupils with additional support needs will be affected the most by disruption to their education. This policy will also impact those who are right on the margin of affording to attend independent schools. The ISC claim that around a third of independent school children are not paying the full fees. They are there because of special needs or academic excellence, not because of how rich their parents are. Yes. In fact, in most cases, money cannot buy you a place at a top independent school. Only merit can. As the SCIS highlighted, children who are in receipt of fee assistance will be the most at risk of being forced out of independent schools. The organisation has stated the finances of those families have, and I quote, already been rigorously means-tested and assessed as the limit of what they can afford. Therefore, we know they cannot afford to pay any more. Being forced to move school will be particularly detrimental to children with additional support needs. Now, none of this that seems to have been properly or even slightly considered by the government, which charged ahead with this policy at breakneck speed. This Labour government did not sit down to have discussions around the impact the policy will have on vulnerable children. They charged ahead because this is an ideological and political move. It's not meant to help the country. It's intended to appease the left-wing fringe of the Labour Party. Mr Vickers, the third problem I want to highlight is the dreadful consequences on some young people who will be forced to move school. This policy could be devastating for those who will have to start again somewhere new. Students forced to move schools may be ripped out of a friend network. They may be taken out of a stable setup which they are used to. They may be forced, through absolutely no fault of their own, into a very different learning environment. Now, has the government not made any assessment of the emotional and mental health damage that this will cause to our young children, or do they just not care? And to make matters worse, that could happen to them at a critical moment in their education, for instance in an exam year or at a moment when they're about to choose subjects which will influence their later career. How can it possibly be fair to inflict that on young people? What have they done to deserve such upheaval? Why couldn't this policy, if it had to be brought in, have come through a delayed introduction period so parents could at least plan with a bit of warning? It is clear that this is not an attack on wealthy parents, but an attack on vulnerable children. And as I've also already noted, many of these young people will have additional support needs and may not be well suited to a sudden change of environment. It is estimated that in Scotland alone, 6,000 pupils will have their learning disrupted by being forced out of the sector. That's 6,000 young people in Scotland who will suffer for no good reason. It's wrong what this government is inflicting on young people, but they seem to neither listen or care. I'll happily give way.
I thank the gentleman for giving way. He's talking with great passion about a subject which is of interest to him and all of us. But I know that in Edinburgh, the gentleman talked about many thousands of children facing displacement. But in Edinburgh, I think the number is somewhere between 50 and 60, which has moved from the private sector into the state sector. And Edinburgh does have one of the largest private sectors in the UK. Where are the other thousands coming from? If I could ask the gentleman that question.
Well, I'm grateful for the point the honourable member has made. Of course, he represents a part of Scotland which has one of the highest, if not the highest, proportion of young people going to independent schools. And I know from the conversations I've had, not just with my own constituents, but from the the teaching staff within a number of the schools within his own constituency how concerned they are about the number of young people, the number of parents who are now considering taking their children out of that sector because they no longer can afford to pay the fees. And the Honourable Member will know from his discussions, these are not necessarily wealthy parents. I remember speaking to people on the doorstep during the last election, parents who have made really tough choices about how they lead their lives to ensure that they're able to pay the school fees, very often to go to schools in his own constituency, because that is the choice that they have decided to make about how they want their children to be brought up. And I think it's wrong that this government is potentially taking that choice away, or making it much more difficult for families to send children to some of the very, very good schools that he supposedly represents. Now, Mr Vickers, yes, happily.
Thank you very much. I thank the honourable member for giving me, as someone who represents certainly a different part of Edinburgh, where we do have 1 in 4 or 5 pupils going to independent schools. I have already received representations from parents who are having to take the children out of schools and concerned about where they can be placed in the city, in a city where the Labour Council has already said that at least 15, possibly 16 schools will be at capacity by the end of the decade without extra pupils. Would he agree with me?
Absolutely. I think the honourable lady, the member for Edinburgh West, makes an excellent point. I mean, there are so many young people, particularly in the city that she represents, who are going to the independent sector. It's going to have a much bigger, disproportionate effect to her city and the honourable member's constituency compared to other parts of Scotland and indeed other parts of the United Kingdom. I do have to say it's very disappointing how dismissive the Labour members are to these concerns that are being raised by schools that he supposedly represents. Mr Vickers, the fourth point I want to make is the one that really undermines Labour's stated reasons for going ahead with this policy. There are huge potential costs to state schools that will arise from pupils moving out of independent schools. Every pupil that moves from independent school to a state school will incur more cost to taxpayers. Every single one of those students were not costing the government any money, but now their entire education will be met at the cost to the taxpayer. Now, the government thinks it's being clever by raising a tax to support public services without coming to the obvious realisation that they're also raising the cost of providing public services. Just look at the numbers of students. There are 30,000 pupils in independent schools in Scotland alone. Across the UK, the Independent Schools Council say that their survey data shows that 8,500 children have already left or didn't start at independent schools last September, and another 3,000 are expected to have left in January. The Council has stated that it's nearly 4 times the government's estimate for this year alone. And the kicker is that the real test is going to be in September 2025, once this policy really hits parents' heart. All of those pupils will now have their education delivered by the state, and taxpayers will have to pay for it. Now that I've outlined the great damage this policy could do, let me turn to what the Labour government has said in response and rebut some of the ridiculous claims it has made. The government stated in response to this petition that this policy will raise, and I quote, £1.8 billion a year, helping to deliver the government's commitment for children in state schools. Except that may not be the case, Mr Vickers. It may not raise anywhere near that amount because it is an estimate, not a hard fact. That claim also does not fully take into account the cost to public finances of so many young people joining the state school system all at once. So it's a big claim, but it doesn't really stack up. Let's look at what else Labour have claimed. Yes, I'll happily give way.
Thank you, gentleman, for giving way. I think it's important to remember that where there's uncertainty with a number, the revenue could either be slightly lower or slightly higher. We don't know, but nonetheless, there will be revenue. There will be revenue generated from this policy. And when I did speak to the principal of an independent school in my constituency last week, and she did outline some of the challenges that she faces because of this policy. But the challenge we face here is that it will generate revenue. If we end this policy today, and I know we can't, that revenue will have to be found from somewhere else. So that's the gentleman, where should we find that revenue? And perhaps he could start with public services in his constituency we could find that money from. Thank you.
Mr Vickers, of course, the last government increased revenue expenditure in our schools during our time in office. And, of course, if there's fewer pupils going to the independent sector, there's going to be fewer opportunities for the Labour government to charge this VAT charge. So, in itself, it's not going to raise the revenue that is anticipated. And I've been very intrigued from the discussions the honourable member has had with the multiple independent schools in his constituency. If one single school has indicated any support for this policy, perhaps I'm more than happy to intervene on that. I'm more than happy if the honourable member for happily take an intervention if you can name one school in Edinburgh that supports this policy.
The honourable member go ahead.
I thank the honourable gentleman for inviting my intervention. What I will say, is I think I'm right in saying that more than half of the voters in Edinburgh voted for the policy. So I'll ask the honourable gentleman, does he think they were wrong?
Mr Vickers, I'd be amazed if the voters of Edinburgh have endorsed this policy in the way that he suggests. I suggest he goes onto some of the Facebook page groups that are supporting the Edinburgh parents directly affected. Some of his constituents are directly affected by this policy, and put that suggestion into that Facebook group to see how many of them come back and say they support this policy. I suspect very, very few will. If he pays any attention to those groups, they will know how much animosity there is amongst Scottish parents in Edinburgh about this policy. I'm going to give way to Mr Tice.
I'm most grateful to the honourable member for giving way. Does he agree with me that it's quite possible that actually this ludicrous policy raises the square root of net zero? Once you knock off possibly 100,000 children not going to independent schools, once you knock off the recovery of input costs from schools, once you knock off the closure of schools, and once you knock off the reduction in bursaries because the schools can't afford to give them.
The honourable member is absolutely right, and that leads me very neatly on to my next point. So let's look at what else the Labour government have claimed. They said ending tax breaks for private schools was a tough but a necessary decision that will secure additional funding to help deliver the government's commitment relating to education and young people. Now, Mr Vickers, again, I want to point out that supposed extra funding is far from guaranteed. This policy is unlikely to raise what has been stated, and it may well incur far greater costs to taxpayers than anticipated too. Let me state plainly, nothing about this decision was necessary. This did not need to happen now or in this manner. It could have been considered in detail with all the repercussions weighed up at the very least. The government also estimates that in the long term, 37,000 pupils will leave or never enter the UK private school sector as a result of this VAT charge. Mr Vickers, that number may also prove to be a nonsense, and if so, the government's entire basis for doing this will fall apart. If the number is higher, the cost of public finances will be higher and less revenue will be raised, which is a potentially vicious double whammy for the Treasury, inflicted entirely by Labour's own design. I'll give way to the honourable lady.
Honourable gentlemen agree that this policy was well documented in the 2017, 2019 and 2024 Labour manifestos. So people voting in this election in 2024 were well aware of the Labour's policy in this regard.
I think if the honourable lady engages, and I'm sure she has, with the parents affected by this and the schools affected by this, one of their criticisms is the speed and the haste by which this policy has been introduced, and the inability of the schools and the parents to make plans to adjust to this severe tax hike. I can't think of any other example of where a government has tried to increase taxes by 20% in one go, and that is one of the main reasons they are so concerned. The failure to engage, the failure to discuss, the failure to properly understand how this is going to impact, and the perception it's only wealthy parents that are going to be affected by this. Again, the honourable lady will know from her own constituency about people who are making these tough choices about whether they send their young people to one of the local independent schools and making the choices about how they lead their lifestyles and their budgeting accordingly. And I just think it's very, very sad that these young people are going to be disrupted as a consequence of this policy. Now, Mr Vickers, the Government also stated that many of the resulting moves into state schools are expected to take place at natural transition points, such as when a child moves from primary to secondary school or at the beginning of exam courses. That is pure assertion. It's made up. It's fantasy. The Government has no guarantees whatsoever that that will be the case. There is no evidence to suggest pupils will only move at natural transition points. Many parents will be unable to afford the extra bills and have to move them immediately and not at a natural time. As I stated earlier, it could easily be at a critical moment in the child's development. The Government has also stated, and I quote, "These policies will not impact pupils with the most acute additional needs." That is plainly false. It's not even close to the truth. The Independent Schools Council say the opposite. The Scottish Council of Independent Schools say the opposite. Individual head teachers say the opposite. The Government's policy will impact vulnerable pupils with additional needs. It's simply shameful to try and claim otherwise. It's a huge disservice to the many parents out there doing their best for young people who just want a bit more help. Mr Vickers, can I conclude by thanking the petitioner again, and also all those who have signed this important petition. I look forward to hearing from other honourable and right honourable members about their views on this petition. I believe this reckless policy is being pursued for political and ideological reasons. It's not about what's best for the country. It's a move to placate the left wing of the Labour Party. It will cost pupils, it will cost parents, and it will cost taxpayers. It will leave both independent and state schools worse off. Labour promised change. Well, here it is. Change for the worse. Thank you.
I remind members that they should bob if they wish to take part in the debate. The question is that this House has considered E-petition 701268 relating to VAT on independent school fees and business rates relief for independent schools. I call Alison Taylor.
It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I thank the member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh, Selkirk for bringing this petition to the House today. I would like to begin by saying that I have considerable sympathy for the petitioners. I know there are many reasons why families make the choice to send their children to a private school. I have been contacted by constituents who felt their children's needs were not being met in local state schools, and they felt that they had no choice but to go private. I know too that families make sacrifices in order to be able to afford fees. I have been contacted by families who send their children to St Columba's Junior and Senior School in Kilmacombe in the neighbouring constituency to my own. I know that the new VAT measures, combined with other costs, have led to a 20% increase in school fees from the beginning of 2025, and this is difficult for the families and for the school. I do appreciate that for some families, the speed with which this measure was introduced has been difficult, and not just for the 50 or so signatories to this petition in my constituency. I am encouraged by the extent to which schools have been able to offset VAT on capital charges against input VAT, making the effective increase lower than the 20%. But it's clear other pressures have caused the increase in school fees to be necessary. I am aware school fees have been increasing year on year in any event, so not all of the increase is down to VAT. Ultimately, government is about making choices. This government was elected on a clear manifesto commitment to introduce VAT on private school fees. The expressed intention was to use the revenue raised to improve funding for schools in the state sector. In England, the government has been setting out plans for school rebuilding, introducing breakfast clubs, supporting school attendance and recruiting new teachers, all of which will help to build up the state sector and give pupils in England the best chance of the foundational education that has the capacity to fundamentally change the trajectory of those children's lives.
The UK is now the only country in Europe to tax education. Does the honourable member recognise that this policy is about Labour's ideology, not about improving education for all children across our country, irrespective of whether they are in the state or independent sector?
I thank the honourable lady for her intervention, and I simply don't agree with that. I would refer to my earlier point that it was in Labour's manifesto in 2017, 2019 and 2024. This is a long-standing policy of the Labour Party.
If I understand the honourable lady's point, that because the Labour government now has a stonking majority, that therefore this policy is now approved by the British people. Is she therefore saying that in 2017 they rejected this policy, in 2019 they rejected this policy, and then suddenly in 2024 the majority of the population converted this policy? Or is she really saying what we all know, that the British people did not vote for Labour based on this policy, and they didn't understand the effect that it's going to have not just on the independent sector but also on the state sector?
I think my point refers to the timing point that the honourable gentleman has been making. I'll carry on. In Scotland, it is up to the national Scottish Government to decide how to use the significant additional funds it is receiving through the block grant. As expenditure in education in England increases, so do the resources available to the Scottish Government. In spite of taxing Scottish families more than in any other part of the UK and receiving the largest increase in the block grant since the Parliament was formed, there is little to show for it in state schools in Scotland. In spite of the incredible hard work of teachers and support staff in schools in Scotland, the attainment gap continues to increase and the standards and results continue to fall. Of course I will.
Thank you very much. I agree with the honourable lady that the state of the education system in Scotland is appalling and the blame lies squarely with the SNP. But how does she feel that it will help the state sector to recover by putting extra pressure on it, by forcing parents to move their children to places that don't exist?
Well, I think, as again has been well documented, this policy is going to raise £1.8 billion towards the state sector. So I'll carry on. This government has made the hard decisions necessary to improve education for all children, including introducing VAT on private school fees. This is already starting to make a difference in England, and I sincerely hope that the Scottish Government will take a short break from stirring up grievance within the UK and focus their attention on the meeting of the real needs of families in Scotland. Can I just finish up by saying that myself and other members spent all or part of their education in the independent sector in the past, but I have no family members currently in the independent sector. I honestly do not know if the increase in fees would have resulted in different choices for my family given the time that has passed, but my comments therefore relate to what I've been told by parents impacted in my own constituency. Thank you.
Damien Hines.
As always, a great pleasure to see you in the chair. And I thank and commend Mr Beckinsale and the other 114,948 petitioners, including 611 in my constituency of East Hampshire, for bringing this very important subject to the floor of Westminster Hall today. With all we've heard, you might ask the question, well, why would the government do this? Actually, in the scheme of things, I mean, it is a revenue raiser, but in the scheme of things, it's not the most enormous revenue raiser, and it is causing all sorts of disruption already and will be more in the education of children. So why are they doing it? I mean, I think the answer is fairly straightforward. They genuinely were in the market for tax rises, and tax rises that didn't break their rules. They'd set themselves on income tax, on VAT, and with a cough, national insurance contributions. And when looking down the list, this one looked quite popular. Certainly quite popular with Labour members, certainly very popular with the left wing of the Labour Party, and I think they thought it could be sold quite easily to the British public. Also, they could link it to definable things. They could link it to the provision of breakfast clubs or mental health support or recruiting 6,500 teachers. Now, none of those things, Mr Vickers, is new. There are already breakfast clubs in literally thousands of schools supported by state funding. As far as I can tell, their programme for mental health support just continues the programme for mental health support of the previous government. And recruiting 6,500 teachers to the state sector is a material slowdown compared to the previous 5 years, the number of teachers that was recruited then. And they will have calculated that many schools, they believe, will absorb this increase. They think, yes, okay, some families may be priced out, but they think it's going to be a relatively minor number, and anyway, be massively outweighed by the revenue. And anyway, and we've heard this line so many times from a government spokesperson, in any case, there are so many places free, empty, in the state sector that they can be very easily absorbed. Now, many of us on this side of the House think that taxing education is just wrong in principle.
Hear, hear.
We value diversity and we believe in the sanctity of parental choice. But from a Labour point of view, with everything I've just listed, so far, so good. But, Mr Vickers, I think they made 5 crucial errors. The first was that belief that schools might be able to absorb such a tax increase. Now, economists know, and there's one thing we know about the Chancellor, Mr Vickers, is she is an economist. Very definitely. And periodically she reminds us. And economists know that when you get an increase in an indirect ad valorem tax, that does not get absorbed fully by the producer. It gets shared between the two, between the seller and the buyer. And with a tax increase of this degree, 20% added to the price of a service, clearly that is going to be very difficult for any organisation. But in these organisations, schools, they just don't have those kind of margins to fall back on and to be able to absorb such an increase. And to the extent they can absorb the increase, they can only do that by cutting their service to those families, and so therefore increasing the displacement effect of children from the private sector to the state. The Honourable Lady.
Does the Honourable Gentleman agree, though, that they can offset some of the VAT against their...
Yes, I just said so.
Yeah, but so it's not 20% then, it's closer probably to 15%.
Well, I'm coming on to that. I'm grateful to her, so you can keep teeing me up. Because the second error, Mr Vickers, was to fail to consider the cumulative effect of all the different cost pressures being added onto schools. So as well as VAT, there's also business rates, which is referred to in this petition. There is also, and by the way, before somebody says it, this was the previous government that brought this in to come in for this year. There's also the increase in the employer contribution for the teachers' pension scheme, which is material for schools in that scheme. And now, of course, we have employer national insurance contributions as well. And so she is right. It wouldn't be quite 20%. It might come down to, say, 15%, but then all those other things add cost on again. The third error that they made was to ignore the existence of geography. So there may well be thousands and thousands of places available in the country, but they are utterly worthless from this perspective if they are not in the places, and by the way, also in the right ages for those children who will be displaced. And overall, this is a great simplification, but overall, the effect of this in primary schools will be relatively small, because we know there is a lot of capacity in primary schools in most parts of the country. Not quite all, by the way, but almost all. But in secondary, there are lots of places where there just aren't enough places to accommodate significant numbers of children being displaced from the private sector, places like Bristol and Bury and Salford and Surrey. Their fourth error was to fail to segment the market. And it's cheap, by the way, the media do this as well. Whenever there's a story about this topic, it is always accompanied by a picture of children in exotic headwear, as if only wearing a boat or a top hat, that was the only type of private school that was available. Now, it is true that there is probably plenty of VAT to be had from the parents of boys at Eton. And the elasticity of demand is probably really quite low. They will also, by the way, those famous old schools, they will also benefit disproportionately from being able to reclaim VAT on capital. So that is actually a benefit towards them. But what they've ignored is the existence of another set of a tranche of schools. So if you've got a low-fee faith school, the VAT you make per child, I say you, this is you, the Exchequer, the VAT you make per child is somewhere between £500 and £1,000 a year. But for every one of those children displaced into the state sector, that's going to cost you £7,000 or more. And it's even higher again if you talk about children with special educational needs or disabilities, who, in many cases, their parents they've just found the place that can accommodate that child, can cater to their needs, and where that child is happy. And in many cases, obviously, parents are making huge sacrifices to fund the fees, but they are doing it willingly. And for some of them, not all of them, but for some of them, this is just going to push them over the edge. They're not going to be able to afford to do it anymore. And the cost per child now for those children into the state sector is that much more. And there's even the extreme case, Mr Vickers, where parents may not be able to afford to send them any longer to the school they've been going to, which might be very expensive, and goes to the local authority, gets an education, health and care plan. And the local authority deems that they have to go back to the same school, but now paid for by the state, and possibly paying for their transport to get there as well. And finally, the fifth error they made was to ignore the effect on specific groups of children, specific families, who we should be seeking to support and encourage. For example, with the continuity of education allowance for our armed forces, and there's been a partial mitigation there. And in the music and dance scheme, the talent of tomorrow, driving forward our creative industries, where there's also been a partial mitigation, but only for families with a household income below £45,000. Overall, Mr Vickers, and it's been said already, this change makes our country an outlier, almost unique in the world, in putting a tax on learning. And it isn't levelling the field as a result between the state and the private. What it's doing is it's making private schools more exclusive than they were before, and therefore widening that divide. It risks losing teachers from the profession. And the biggest effect of all, it's going to make class sizes in state schools bigger, fill up more state schools, and therefore, in the end, make it less likely that as a parent, you get your child into the school of your choice. Now, this has now happened. It happened in January. It is done. But it's not too late for the Minister to say he will keep an open mind, and to say that after 2 years of this policy being in place, they'll review the effects, they'll look at the revenues, they'll look at the effect on displacement of children, disruption of education, they'll look at the number of extra education, health and care plans. And if it turns out that those effects have not all been as they expected, will they reverse it?
Thank you, Mr Vickers. It's a pleasure to see the newly minted Minister in his place. I think the first time I'm in a debate with him, and it's a pleasure to follow the right honourable gentleman who was the Secretary of State, who I sometimes see on the district line because we head the same way. I rise to speak on behalf of my constituents who've contacted me on this issue. But they turn up in my inbox, in person, at the advice surgery that I do every Friday, on the doorstep, the meeting and greeting voters in the recent general election. Comes alongside an array of different issues raised by mums and dads. And, you know, I'm familiar with the arguments. I've read the government's response. Very compelling figures. 94% of school children in the UK attend state schools, including my own. And I know it polls very well as well. However, it's just that of those 6%, 14 of those private schools are in the constituency of Ealing Central Acton. There were 15, in fact, in 2023. One has closed its doors since then. So I just wanted to sort of vocalise some of their concerns to my honourable friend, the Minister. So, yeah, it's a higher than average number, 14 of these schools. 821 people signed this petition. Now, that's not even in the top 10. So if you look at the heat map, the top 10 seats, it's over 1,000 in all of those, and they tend to be, I think there are 2 in Surrey, but of the remaining 8, they tend to have a W, NW or SW postcode. So I think what I'm trying to say is it's a fairly West London type phenomenon, if you look at those signatures and where the distribution of these schools are. And in fact, if you look at the 650 constituencies across the land, the first one on the list, I think it's single digits. It's a seat in Wales, starting with A, Aberconwy or somewhere like that. So, this is not a phenomenon everywhere, but in West London, it's not that unusual. The honourable gentleman who I can see opposite me, his high school, not very far from my high school in my constituency. So I was a Notting Hill girl. I know he was a St Benedict's back in the day pupil. The minister who's often sent to respond to this debate, my neighbouring MP for Ealing North, his prep school, Durston House, in my seat of Ealing Central and Acton. So I do feel we shouldn't demonise these parents. They're, in some senses, people that I've grown up with, live alongside, and they do have genuine concerns. So, I mean, as I say, myself, as a parent, I would never dream of going private, but I can understand and accept that people do this. And certainly in the 80s, when I went to school, this was before sort of reforms of a Labour government that have made excellent state schools too in my constituency. So in the 80s, that was the dark days of Thatcherism. So my parents chose to put me, I was a state sector for my primary, Montpelier Primary. But, as a parent myself, I have benefited from Gordon Brown's reforms, the Child Trust Fund. I think it came to maturity for my son recently. It did go up in the end. It was the one that could go up as well as down. That's not. So I myself have not used this sector as a child, as a parent, as a child. I did. It wasn't my own choice, but I can completely appreciate that people like my own parents at the time make, and my honourable friend mentioned it as well, enormous sacrifices to send their children there. And I've heard this on the doorstep. We have the worst car. We never go on holiday. That was me in the 80s. So look. The government response asserts pupils... So I just wanted to point out some unintended consequences, possibly, of this policy, just to make my honourable friend aware. And also, the other thing is these are people who consider themselves working people. So again, the strapline of the Labour manifesto was no taxes on working people. So I think we should be careful with our rhetoric sometimes and not seek to... Hang on, let me carry on. So look, just unintended consequence number one, or in fact maybe commonly misstated thing, is that pupils with an education, health and care plan still remain eligible. It is impossible in West London to get one of those. So, for example, we've all taken on new wards in our boundaries. So I don't only represent Ealing Borough now, I have a bit of Hammersmith and Fulham. So a head from one of my primary schools there was saying they have a large percentage of SEND, special educational needs, pupils there. And the thing is, the wards I've inherited are sort of north of the borough of Shepherd's Bush way. So apparently, by the age you come to school and these issues show up, it's kind of too late. Whereas if you're a sharp-elbowed middle-class parent from the south of the borough, you might have had your child at a very young age done through a private assessment, and you have all that support all the way through. But by school age, there is a waiting list of many years to get the assessment, and then, it's a potluck. So again, maybe that's because a lot of these smaller... The problem is that the word private school implies a whole load of things. They're not all Eton. And some of the comms around this, I think, hasn't been done very sensitively. So I know offence was taken at something about they've all got AstroTurf pitches and swimming pools and embossed stationery, something like that. That did not go down well with my parents and heads. So they're not all like that. So you get your smaller SEND school, you get your smaller faith school. Those kind of people do not, they're not all Eton, is what I'm trying to say. And I think some of these comms are based on a caricature. So let's be careful about what we do here. One parent, Matthew, forwarded me a missive from the private school his boys are at. And it says, for music lessons with peripatetic employed by the school teachers, VAT will need to be applied at the 20% rate. And this constituent says, traditionally, the tax system's been a way of discouraging people from picking up bad habits like smoking and drinking, not from picking up a trombone. So it seems like people are capitalising on this, and then other bad things are coming in through the back door. And he also says, because I've been replying back, trying to sound sympathetic to these parents, you referred to a consultation on the VAT proposals. Like most government consultations, what was passed didn't seem in any significant way different to what was proposed. So, I mean, maybe that's a lesson in life for all of us. If you put something out for consultation, make it look like you listened or something, because he's saying it came exactly the same back. And it's been raised by the right honourable gentleman opposite that actually these elitist private schools, Eton, they've actually done quite well out of this because they can cash in on windfalls from these new VAT rules requiring independent schools. They can claim back from capital projects, buildings, land acquisition over the last 10 years. So all this VAT on costs, it's 20% now, is recoverable when factoring in non-business uses. So basically, this policy will hand schools like Eton money back from Treasury coffers. I mean, surely there's a loophole there, an unintended consequence or something that needs addressing by my honourable friend. And you know, there are long lists of kind of things. I think the Times says Eton spent more than 20 million on a sports centre in 2023. Winchester College, I think our former Prime Minister went there. Their accounts say, can I just finish my sentence? Because I'm getting into my stride and then I will take it. From the same year, says that they spent, Winchester, 15 million on capital expenditure. Radley College in Oxfordshire has got a 20-acre solar farm on its 40-acre woodland. Charterhouse in Surrey, 2 boarding houses built in 2021. They're developing a theatre and lecture theatre. So again, costs can come back for the big boys, but not from the little ones. Yeah, I will give way.
I thank the honourable lady for giving way. As the MP for Windsor, Eton is in my constituency. And whilst I appreciate, as she says, that all the private schools are not Eton, I would point out in their defence that sports centre she used is used by local schools, it's used by community groups, and they do an awful lot in my community. So I accept the point she makes that Eton are not the schools we necessarily want to focus on in this debate, but some of these points I would suggest are a little bit unfair.
I'm interested to learn. I've not finished giving way to the first point. Can we do this sequentially? Let's do it sequentially. I can respond to him first and then I'll take you. Is that all right, Mr. Vickers? Yeah. OK. I mean, it's interesting to learn that, but they still are going to be quids in after this. I think that was my point. Yes, sorry.
Will you give it up with all this stuff about Eton? I speak as a mother of 2 old Etonians. I was a single parent. I worked 3 jobs. When Mr Hines said there's more money from the Etonian parents, there certainly aren't, not from this one. Eton hands out 100 boys plus a year, completely free fees. They don't even have to pay for their pencils. And when it comes to things like Dorney Lake and the sports centre, they hand that back 1,000 times to their local communities across the country. Give it up.
Right, I don't know how parliamentary language that is, but I mean, I'm not going to join in the praise of Eton particularly, because I do think maybe she was an atypical parent. I imagine some of the parents there would be able to bear 20%, and a school that's clever with its accounts, it may just be a rounding error, these kind of things. But I'm talking about your smaller school that doesn't apply. And look, my last example I wanted to give is, well, actually, yes. It's interesting to see the gentleman from Reform there, because I had a massively Remain constituency. 72% of my electorate voted Remain. So it just seems a bit sort of perverse for them that it's leaving the EU that has made this possible. It's a Brexit benefit. So if only we'd never left the EU, this would never be happening. Usually, education is not a taxable luxury good. And there is a fear that if this happens now, what could it be next? Nurseries? Universities? I came from that sector. I used to work there before. So, I mean, it is a slight worry that, you know, this is a loophole, because it contradicts the EU VAT directive. So no VAT on any form of education. And the example is Greece. The 2015 Syriza left-wing government wanted VAT at 23%. They had to abandon it for a slew of different reasons. It was contrary to the EU VAT directive. So, yes, university tuition is rated 0. And there is a worry from my friends in the sector there who will say you're lucky to have got out when you did, because they're closing so many departments in university departments in the UK, that, you know, what could be next. So I hope my honourable friend can assure me that nurseries, universities are off limits. So look, I mean, what I want to say really is that my worry about this, I mean, we've heard all these things that schools are going to close. We've heard a lot of catastrophising. It remains to be seen whether those things will come to pass. One of mine has gone in 2023. But my worry is it will just make an elitist system. It will make an elitist system more elitist. And the government say in their response, ending tax breaks to private schools was a tough but necessary decision. I mean, could there be, when this growth comes, I don't know, could there be a way of undoing it or something? I know it was a very clear policy in many manifestos, so I understand it's not all going to be undone now, but let's think a bit creatively. Yeah, all right.
For giving way, what does she expect her government and party to do then, if she doesn't think they'll give way on this point?
Well, I mean, what I would suggest is possibly doing it on a turnover basis. So for your enormous schools that can afford it, yes. But then for the smaller ones who have been caught in this trap, no. That's what I would suggest. Do it in a slightly different way. And there is an argument also for looking into grammar schools. They're a sort of legacy of many years ago. They don't have them in my area, but I was the Labour candidate in Chesham and Amersham in 2005, and I remember this used to come up as a hustings issue there. And the argument I was always given by the Labour Party in those days was parental choice. We respect parental choice. So, you know, I think these grammar schools, which, again, at times the party opposite has flirted with bringing back more of them, they're even more elitist in a way because they're taking state funds with private school-type facilities. Yes, Dr. Challoner's grammar school in Chesham, where was it? Amersham, whichever. You know, it was way, compared to the school I went to, I felt very small when I went there. So again, maybe something could be done about that, because that's a, you know, inegalitarian system. But anyway, look, just what I want to do is to vocalise some of the concerns from my electorate and just remind everyone that it's not great to always operate on the basis of one size fits all, when in this case it is far from the truth.
Very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve with you as chair and to follow the honourable member. I feel today as if the speakers so far have all been talking about me, because they've been talking about those parents who sent their children to independent schools and who are not rich. I no longer have a declarable interest, but my daughter did go to an independent school. We weren't wealthy. It wasn't easy. It was our choice. It's one we never regretted, but it is one that we often struggled to finance. So I know that there are thousands of parents across the country at the moment, many in my own constituency in Edinburgh West, who are faced with an even bigger challenge because of this change. Now, my daughter went to an independent school in the west of Scotland, and it's a school which was originally the town school. If you come from Glasgow, you'll know which one I mean. But it was originally the town school, and it had a tradition of bursaries being awarded every year, a large number of bursaries. And a lot of the children who were at her school now and who are doing well would not have got that place. A lot of them had challenges that they faced, and the school helped them. So I think when we are talking about this, we need to remember that we're not talking about the Eatons and the Harrows and the big schools. We're talking about a lot of independent schools which provide a service very often in communities. And it's a choice made by parents who are not always rich. And Edinburgh, my city of Edinburgh, is probably, well, in fact, it is one of the areas in this country where we have the highest proportion of children educated in independent schools. It's 1 in 4 in Edinburgh. And I think that's reflected in the figures in the petition here today, because my constituency of Edinburgh West, there were 740 signatures on this petition. That's higher than any other that I remember in my almost 8 years in this place from my constituency. It's reflected in my mailbox, and it's reflected in the concern expressed to me regularly by parents in Edinburgh, and not just from the independent sector. A lot of them have their children in the state sector. There are people who come to me on a regular basis. I have parents every week who cannot get a place for their child in the local state school because they are close to capacity. And that is a problem which will only be worse if many of those 1 in 4 children are forced into the state sector because their parents can no longer afford the choice that they made because of the choice that this government has made. Certainly, yes.
Like her, we're both girls that were in those schools. Her daughter she talked about. Would she accept that often it's parents who want their daughters to have an all-girls education, and there are figures from the girls SGA, I think it's called, and in fact that's the one. And there is also the head of Dame Allen's Girls' School, that say that actually girls thrive better in all subjects, in all girls' environments. Things like physics and maths, they choose more when there aren't boys around mucking about.
Thank you very much. I would accept that point. I absolutely agree. I also, it reminds me of the point that a lot of parents whose children are in independent schools are there because they were struggling in the state sector, and they moved them into the independent sector, and there they are thriving. And rightly or wrongly, that was their choice that we would be taking away from them because of these fees, or at least the Labour government would. I find it difficult to understand a Labour government that would support the principle of taxing education, as well as the practical issues with this policy. They're taxing education. Now, that surely is not something that they would support. And introducing it halfway through the school year has caused issues for many parents who suddenly find that all the budgeting that they had done is out of the window because they have an increase in school fees. They may have more than one child at that school that they simply can no longer afford. And that, as I say, is why so many people are writing to me every week and saying they're having to think about what they do about their child's education and where are they going to find the place. Yes, certainly.
Thank you, and I thank her for giving way. I do find it really interesting when Conservative and Lib Dem colleagues are talking about how wrong it is to place VAT on school fees, but they thought nothing about introducing university fees, which is a huge cost for educating people, particularly people from poor backgrounds. Yeah. but well, the massive rise in tuition fees. Yeah. Come on. You know exactly what I was talking about. Can I speak, please? But so nobody here is questioning the motives of parents who. Every single parent that sends their children to an independent school wants the best for their children. Nobody here is questioning that. But what we are questioning is if we were to scrap this policy, what would we cut instead? And I'm just not hearing this. So this policy will generate additional income for the Honourable Lady's constituency. Where does she want it to be cut from? And what does she say to the majority of people in Edinburgh who voted for parties who supported this policy? Thank you.
Like the Honourable Member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk, I would like to see the evidence that half of the people in Edinburgh voted for this policy, because I have to tell the member from Edinburgh South West there are 311 signatories to this petition from his constituency. More than half of the people in Edinburgh West voted for me. So where he's getting this figure, I really would like to see where this figure that parents in the city have voted for this measure. And I'd like to ask him where he thinks Edinburgh Council is going to find the places. The City of Edinburgh Council is going to find the places when its own figures produced by a Labour administration before this policy was announced showed that 16 schools in the city will be at capacity by 2030. And the problem with that is, where there are places, They're not in places that are convenient necessarily for the children who will be forced to look for a new place in school by this policy. So school rolls, I'll make progress if that's okay. State school rolls already are stretched in Scotland because of the SNP cuts to local government. And this can only make it worse. And on his point of... Yes, certainly.
My goodness me, I mean, I thank Ronald Reagan for giving way. I mean, this policy, if it does generate that 1.8 billion which we heard about earlier, if it does, it could generate more. It should benefit schools in Edinburgh, of course it will. An honourable lady made reference to school roll analysis before this policy was introduced. She did stress that. Since then, there's been an update of that policy and it shows there's more than adequate capacity in Edinburgh, particularly as we only have 55 students moving from the private sector into the state sector. She is well aware of this analysis.
I thank the honourable member, and yes, I am aware of this analysis, and it does not show a healthier figure. My point in saying it was before is that the instant this government came out with this policy, the Labour Council went back and redid the figures. No, I didn't say that. But what I will say is that state schools across the country are stretched. And this £1.8 billion, if he's insisting it's going to go to Scotland, perhaps his ministers can tell us how it's going to get to schools in Scotland, because they have no power to put that money into the state education in Scotland. But this is a national policy. This is a policy which is affecting families up and down this country. This is a policy which is putting more pressure on the state education system everywhere, from Caithness to Cornwall. It's not just about Edinburgh, it's about the entire country. I am here to speak on behalf of my constituents, but I feel that their fears are reflected elsewhere in the country. And I think perhaps if they could tell us, this Labour government, how they are going to make that money effective in protecting state education, how they're going to get the money into schools like the ones in my constituency, then we might listen. But the problem is that all they say is find a different way of making the cuts. Well, we did put forward different ways of raising money. There are ways they could have raised money by reforming capital gains tax. Yep. There are ways they could raise money by putting a tax on social media platforms to raise money for schools, which we suggested. So the alternatives are there. And what they wouldn't be is a tax on education, an ideological-driven policy which has been ill thought through and didn't take account of the unintended consequences.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I first thank the member from Berkshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk for actually presenting this petition. Out of the nearly 115,000 petitioners, I have 500 from my constituency, South West Hertfordshire. Education has always been a really important part of my purpose of coming to this place in all the years, 21 years of elected office, because I know education can change people's potential. I'm lucky enough to be brought up in this country, educated very well, school and university. As others in the House will be aware, I'm dyslexic, and I was not diagnosed with my dyslexia till my mid to late 20s. And I take that as a reflection of the excellent education I was able to benefit from. My concern at the moment, though, is this new Labour government has come in with a strong mandate from the electorate, but I think they're rewriting the terms on how they got that mandate. While there is comments about previous manifestos talking about reform of the independent school sector, I would argue that, given the turnout figures, it was probably a fault of my own party rather than to the credit of the Labour Party that the Labour Party has the 411 MPs that they have to date. And I look forward to the next general election for those roles to be reversed. The concern I have specifically with the proposal on independent schools is, and as others have mentioned, is the policy of taxation education. This, for me, is a dangerous policy. Others have described it as a policy of envy. While we have spoken about the VAT, there is also the reform of the charity status of independent schools and therefore the consequences of business rates. This government, and it's a pleasure to see the Treasury Minister in his place, because I think it's actually a more financial question rather than education policy one, is about the potential revenue generation of this policy, but actually, for me, the wider conversation about supporting the wealth creators and driving economic growth. And like with any business plan, there are assumptions made, and the 1.8 billion being proposed on revenue, I would argue, is probably a bit ambitious. I say that based on two things. The first is that the policy was introduced mid-term, so the beginning of this calendar year, and it did not allow families to adjust. There was no element of transition. And when I speak to parents who have the benefit of sending their children to independent schools, they are feeling very aggrieved because, in their view, they're paying twice. Firstly, by subsidising the rest of the state sector, because then their child is not using their place because they are paying instead for a place at independent school. But secondly, and as someone has spoken about SEND before, my biggest concern is about the SEND provision in the state sector. Hertfordshire has had failings over many years that I know the County Council are working hard on to resolve, but part of that has been subsidised and supported by the excellent private schools I have in my constituency, Merchant Taylors and the Royal Masonic School for Girls being two of them, which means that actually where those parents are able to, they've been able to send their children to independent schools to make sure that they get the support they need in a typically smaller class size, that actually if they were reliant on the state, there would not necessarily be the provision, and if they weren't able to afford it, the timeframes involved with getting ECHP that's been referred to earlier can potentially be years. So you are fundamentally destroying the life chances of children who could have been me 30 years ago, 35 years ago. And that causes me worry. The government's own impact assessment admits that the education tax will impact girls more than boys, as there are a greater number of single-sex private schools for girls than there are for boys who have less of a financial background and longevity of being around. With the pressure that this tax would place on single-sex schools like the Royal Masonic School for Girls in my constituency, I am concerned about the impact that this tax would have on the excellent work that has been done by the private sector to lead the way on ensuring a high quality of education for girls, particularly in STEM and other underrepresented fields. This tax will not just impact those children who are educated in the private sector, and the children who will feel the impact of increased pressure on the state sector, but this will also greatly impact this industry and those employed within it. With over 100 independent schools allegedly expected to close over the next 3 years as a direct result of this tax, many who work in this sector are facing unemployment with the risk of highly skilled teachers leaving the profession or the country as a key consideration. One of the main drivers for communities and successful families staying in this country when we live in a global world is family links, but it's also education standards. And I would argue that actually middle-class parents, who are typically those generating economic growth and employing people, are now considering actually leaving the country and homeschooling or private educating their schools in other parts of the world, because in a modern world, and especially with the government's drive for increased airport capability, it would mean that actually moving back and forth from the Middle East or other parts of Europe would be less burdensome than the increase in taxes and costs associated with the private schools that this government is suggesting. If children are forced to move to a new school within the school year or at key education stages, this will greatly disrupt their education and could cause long-term damage to their prospects. These are the same children that not many years ago were directly impacted by the pandemic, and a lot of the harms associated with that I don't think we've seen yet coming through. So my concern at the moment is not just about financial, but also the education outcomes and actually the life chances of those children if we're forcing them to be disruptive during an academic year based on what I would argue is financials that may not stack up to the ambition that the Treasury wishes it to. The government's own impact assessment admits that the disruption will be caused to the education of SEND pupils, hurting progress in their education and the opportunities and resources available to pupils in the state sector. This was also put more pressure on local authorities who are already stretched to their capacity, and I refer to Hertfordshire County Council earlier. My right honourable friend mentioned faith schools and art schools. In my old constituency, South West Hertfordshire, we had world-leading schools of both types. And while I'm not their representative today, and others in the House do have that honour, I am sure they will be having meetings where their constituency MPs saying, actually, the ability for us to attract world-class pupils and be world-class artists and successful in the years ahead will be greatly diminished by this government's decision on this. The questions I have for the Minister, and I'm glad it is a Treasury Minister rather than an education one, because we've all been in education debates before, is being brave. At what point would the Minister look to actually reverse these decisions? There was talk about a review in 2 years' time. I would actually go a bit further and ask for a sunset clause on this policy, because one of the greatest attractions of our great country has been its education standards, and I applaud my right honourable friend for the great work he did over many, many years, which means that actually for us to remain a global leader, both in the economy and education, we need to give pupils the best opportunities possible, but also need to attract the best educators in the world. And historically, we've done that with pay scales. I think one of the things my party has suggested is that, given some of this government's policies, teachers may end up taking a pay cut. So I'd be interested to see what the Minister says on those points. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well done.
Thank you. Nice.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the honourable member for securing this debate on the back of the petitioners. How many of us, Chair, were elected to this great place to damage the prospects of our children? I would hope the answer to that is none. But that is the absolute direct consequence of this ludicrous policy to tax education. I think the only country in the developed world to do so. The unintended consequences are truly shocking. Within a fortnight of this policy coming into force at the beginning of this year, some 4 schools announced they were closing this summer. Over 1,000 children immediately plunged into uncertainty about where they were going to school, who were going to be their friends, the anxiety that put on them as children, let alone their parents, shames everybody in this government. Tens of thousands of pupils will end up leaving the independent sector, and it's independent, not private, because most independent schools are charities reinvesting their surpluses. Tens of thousands will leave the sector. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank him for giving way. As others have said, I do have independent schools in my constituency, and the challenges we face with this policy are very real. But what makes it difficult to talk about those challenges are numbers, people saying tens of thousands of students are going to move from the independent sector to the state sector. I don't think anybody really thinks that's going to happen. And I think those kind of numbers make it really difficult to have a serious debate about this issue. So does he agree that talking about tens of thousands of students is perhaps at the upper end of estimations in this field?
I'm grateful because he has reminded me to declare a historic interest. Not only did I have children in independent schools, but I was the chairman of the Finance and General Purposes Committee for a significant independent school. Over the last 6 or 7 years, I finished just before the election, and I saw, even when this policy was announced as a prospect, an immediate drop-off in applications for places to go to that school. So I can confirm, with absolute experience, that tens and tens of thousands will leave the sector, if not 100,000. And amongst the damage to children, surely the least of all children we want to damage the prospect for are those with special education needs. And yet that is actually where the independent sector excels so much. And let me just give you a small example. In the county of Lincolnshire, I get a letter from a constituent who can no longer afford to send 2 children, both with special education needs, to the independent school, so they're going to have to go into the state sector, where there is a capacity crisis that we keep hearing about in the Commons, and because of the travel distance, she can't provide the travel, and so the local authority, the county council, has to provide the travel. Just for those 2 children alone, the annual cost in taxes is £20,000 per child. This is absolute insanity, I would respectfully suggest, Madam Chair. It's lovely to see you. So we have damage to children, the worst of all worlds. And then we look at the prospects for people. We hear children in the state sector, and we hear that this is going to pay for 6,500 teachers. That's about one teacher in every 4 or 5 schools. 3, I think, in the secondary sector. Is that seriously? When you look at the extra children that are going to go into the state sector, the tens and tens of thousands, what will actually happen is there's more pressure on the existing class sizes, on the existing teachers, who will therefore be able to dedicate less time per child in their existing school. So actually, the prospects for children are damaged not just across the independent sector, but across the whole of the state sector as well, in this deeply, deeply misguided policy. And I touched earlier on the issue of the cost. When this was announced it was going to raise £1.5 billion and suddenly it's £1.8 billion, I would suggest to you it'll raise the square root of net zero. The reality is that schools will be recovering input costs, including on capital schemes. The reality is schools will be losing children into the state sector. The reality is that actually bursaries will have to be slashed. We've heard about some schools giving hundreds of free places. All of these will put extra costs onto the state sector, the state schools, as well as the pressures on the county councils, on the taxi budgets, which is ludicrous. So, from an educational quality point of view, it makes no sense. From a cost point of view, it makes no sense. When actually, there was an opportunity for this government to say, actually, you in the independent sector, you're doing some things really well, in particular with regard to special educational needs. So we'd like you, the independent sector, to help us a bit more. Share some of your expertise. Can you take some more places for special education? That was the opportunity, and I can tell you the independent sector would have welcomed that request and that ask with open arms. Share expertise with local schools. That would have been the right thing to do to improve the prospects for everybody. The other right thing to do, in order to improve the prospects for everybody, was to adopt the Reform UK policy in the general election, which would say, if you can afford to pay a bit more, we'd like to encourage you to take your children out of the state sector into the independent sector, so you relieve the pressure on class sizes by granting tax relief at basic rate for those who send to independent schools. That would have then improved the prospects for everybody. Those are the opportunities, but instead what we've seen is deep ideological socialism. That's what we've actually seen, with no evidence whatsoever that this will make any difference. And it is discriminatory, because if it was logical, then actually you'd be applying VAT on university fees, because, of course, universities are elitist. 3 or 4 in 10 youngsters go to university, so surely the same policy should be applied to universities. I would like the Minister, when he replies, just to confirm that when the legal cases go possibly all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights, that some people love and some of us don't, if the ruling from the European Court of Human Rights is that actually this policy is unlawful, then the Minister can confirm that they will agree with that policy and apply it. Because actually, this policy has no logic whatsoever. It's a tragedy for all of us. But most importantly, it's an absolute tragedy for children.
Yeah. Pinkerton.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship today.
My constituency of Surrey Heath is home to many outstanding state schools and academies, and to 6 small, extraordinary, highly performing independent schools: Hallgrove, Lyndhurst, Coworth Flexlands, Woodcote House, Knoll Hill and Fernway School. It's quite possible that none of you have heard, no honourable members have heard of those schools. They're not necessarily the big names, but they provide extraordinary educations to an extremely loyal following. They not only provide excellent educations, they also provide essential support, catering to a wide range of educational and pastoral needs. For children with special educational needs and disabilities, they offer tailored learning environments with small classes, dedicated learning assistants and specialist therapies that parents would otherwise have to battle to access through Surrey's appalling state system, and very often unsuccessfully so. But beyond those academic provisions, those schools also foster a nurturing environment that prioritises well-being. And that's particularly crucial to children from military families, who rely on those schools for stability and continuity of education amidst the turbulence of frequent relocations and parental deployments overseas. For those children, the stability offered by the independent sector, particularly independent boarding schools, helps to ease the disruption of constant change, providing a reliable support system that nurtures mental health and lifts academic achievement. By offering structure, stability, familiarity, these schools play a crucial role in helping military children thrive. Back in October, I stood in this chamber to highlight the damaging impact that VAT rises would have on the independent schools, particularly to service families. The government has, I'm pleased to say, subsequently committed to increasing funding for the continuity of education allowance to offset rising private school fees. Now, that undoubtedly is welcome, and yet that adjustment doesn't adequately cover the full costs of the VAT increase. As the RAF Families Federation has pointed out, military families receiving continuity of education allowance for private schooling are required to provide and contribute a minimum of 10% towards tuition fees, with rising school fees that by necessity reflect inflationary pressures, plus business rates, plus national insurance increases, plus this new VAT imposition. That 10% minimum contribution is growing significantly in real terms for hard-working, committed service families. Now, as a country, we ask our military families to make extraordinary sacrifices on our behalf. With the rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape, it looks as though we'll need to lean on those families even more into the future. And arguably nowhere is that more evident, more apparent than in my constituency of Surrey Heath. The presence of Sandhurst Military Academy and the Army Training Centre at Purbright means that my constituency plays a vital role in supporting and accommodating service families. The 6 independent schools within Surrey Heath and many others beyond are essential pillars of support for those families whose lives are often marked by uncertainty in the service of the state. So can I ask the Minister to look again at the continuity of education allowance and to ensure that it keeps up with rising school fees, while making sure that service families aren't financially penalised for the continued commitment to the defence of the United Kingdom?
Gregory Stafford.
Thank you very much, Mrs Lilbuck, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. And I also want to congratulate my honourable friend for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk for leading today's debate. I must declare an interest as the father of children who attend an independent school currently. Mrs Lilbuck, it's not a pleasure, I'm afraid, to speak today about this vicious, vindictive and ultimately financially valueless policy that Labour government has brought in. As has previously been said, no other country, no serious other country in the world taxes education. And the sort of schools that are being taxed are faith schools, arts, drama, music schools, single-sex schools, the armed forces schools or armed forces parents who send their children to independent schools. And just as a side note, I was speaking to a member of our armed forces last week, and they said to me that their view, this implication was a breach of the military covenants, in their opinion. And this is not a tax break as I know other ministers on this side, on that side of the House, have mentioned, tax on education has never been levied in this country, and therefore this is an additional tax on education. It is not a tax break. And as other honourable members have said, actually parents who make the sacrifice to send their children to the independent sector are saving money for the state sector. Now, across my constituency of Farnham, Borden, Haslemere, Liphook and its surrounding villages, we are very lucky to have 11 excellent independent schools catering to both junior and senior pupils. But unfortunately, only last Friday, we discovered that one of those schools is going to close at the end of this academic year. The Royal School in Hindhead has been a cornerstone of education since 1840. It was formerly the Royal Navy School, and it was specifically set up to educate girls. The founders specifically had the ambition for girls to become independent members of society, an absolute pioneering school in this case. And as other honourable members have said, girls, single-sex education has worked wonders for girls in terms of their educational but also their social mobility. Now, the school has become co-educational more recently, but as my honourable friend from South West Hertfordshire said, this is a real problem. And while I recognise that the school did have ongoing financial difficulties, it is deeply unfortunate that the Labour Party's policies on these low-fee schools, those charging around £3,000 per term, seem to have been the final blow to the long-standing viability of that school. And the Royal School has not only been a significant educational institution for generations of pupils, but also a key part of the fabric of our community, employing people, helping the state sector with areas that they can't produce. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to the dedicated teachers and staff who've worked tirelessly over the years, and to acknowledge the sense of loss felt by all of us in the Haslemere community. However, it's equally important to highlight the profound impact that this closure will have on the parents and families who are now faced with the difficult task of finding alternative provision. Now, take Mr. Chancellor, who spoke to my office only this morning. He's a single father of an adopted child. Mr. Chancellor took the financial strain of the fee-paying place at the Royal School to allow him to drop his child at school and know that between the hours of 7:45 and 5:30, his child would be cared for, fed and looked after. And this allowed my constituent the flexibility of extra time to work on his small business. This is the sort of impact that is happening to local people, hard-working people, that this Labour government professes to want to support. Families like Mr. Chancellor's will either have to seek places in other independent schools or, regrettably, be forced to turn to an already overstretched and underfunded mainstream education system. And while Mr. Chancellor has commended the work of Surrey County Council and Mish's team, who were also, to be frank, left in the dark about the school's closure, there is clear anxiety for parents whose children's fate is currently unclear. And state schools across Farnham, Borden, Haslemere and Liphook are already bursting at the seams. I'd like to point out to the members here that the fees charged by the independent schools are often only a quarter or even perhaps a half of the cost of state school provision per pupil, meaning for decades independent schools have taken huge strains from the state system in educating a percentage of our nursery to young person pupils. Now, last October, following a meeting I organised with the Shadow Chancellor and my right honourable friend, the member for East Hampshire, in my constituency, I wrote to the Department and to the Treasury. In the then Exchequer Secretary's reply, he emphasised that this policy was supposedly forecast to raise around £1.8 billion. But realistically, even if that were true, and I think we dispute that heavily on this side, that's a mere drop in the ocean for government spending, particularly when research from the Taxpayers Alliance has reported that this policy comes at a net loss for the Treasury, as state spending has been forced to stretch per capita to facilitate 35,000 pupils expected to be educated now within the mainstream schooling system. Now, last week, Surrey County Council admitted to me that it does not have enough state school places to accommodate children transferring to state schools. When will this government understand that these policies are crippling local authorities who are trying immensely hard to cope with the volume of displaced children? And it's not just the fact there aren't enough places in the state sector. My right honourable friend for East Hampshire will know all too well that Alton Convent School in his constituency closed last year. And during the general election campaign, I knocked on the door of a gentleman whose children had just got a place at that school, only to find that now they wouldn't have that place. But they could not get a place in the local state school because he had not sent his children to the local junior feeder schools. So he would not have been able to get a place, even if there had been a place at the local school. But, Mrs Lill-Buck, in my constituency, no group has been more profoundly affected by the government's damaging policies towards independent schools than the parents and families of children with special educational needs and disabilities. The closure of the Royal School and the narrowing of education options available only serves to exacerbate the already significant challenges faced by these families. Across my constituency, we are fortunate to have 3 special schools: Undershaw, Pathways, Moore House. And since my election, I've met with multiple head teachers, including Jonathan Hetherington, the head teacher at Moore House, a renowned SEND school for boys in Frensham. And only this morning, I attended a meeting with 25 parents from the last Wednesday SEND support group in Farnham. They were charitable enough, because Wednesdays is not great for us as members of Parliament, to change their name to the first Monday just for me this week. I joke, but actually, one lady was in tears this morning about the impact that this spiteful policy is going to have on their child. Many are going to be forced to navigate a new school, new academic curriculums, all while receiving little to no support without a formal EHCP. And some of my constituents across both counties in Surrey and Hampshire are having to wait 24 months to receive their EHCPs. And between 2019 and 2024, the uptake in EHCPs in Surrey was 63%, and in Hampshire, 93%, both well above the national average. So can the Minister, when he's responding, tell us what is being done and what conversations he's being had with the Department of Health and Social Care to expedite that process and the Department of Education? But what I'm genuinely concerned about is, in my local area, is the 17% of independent school pupils who are receiving SEND support, but only 6% of whom have a formal EHCP. And I want to quote the Prime Minister, who shared the government's supposed plan for SEND pupils who don't have an EHCP or are in the process of acquiring one. In June, the Prime Minister told LBC listeners that where there isn't an EHCP, that exemption doesn't apply. So there is no assurance for those children and those parents. I didn't receive any assurance from the Minister in last week's debate on SEND and educational support, and I'd like to ask the Minister again to confirm that the 93,000 children in the independent sector who receive SEND support but don't have a formal EHCP are not going to be included at all in the SEND education support plans, as the Prime Minister seemed to outline in June. Mrs Lill-Buck, introducing a 20% VAT increase on independent school fees is not just a fiscal policy, it's a direct assault on the educational choice and social mobility of our constituents. This policy threatens to attack thousands of students into an already strained system, undermining the very fabric of our diverse educational landscape. The influx from the independent sector will exacerbate existing pressures, leading to larger class sizes and diminished resources for all. Is this really the legacy this Labour government wants to leave? A society where educational diversity, which leads to educational excellence, is sacrificed at the altar of a misguided, malign and class envy-fuelled fiscal policy? I urge the Minister to reverse this punitive tax and actually champion a system that upholds choice, fosters excellence and truly invests in the future of every child.
Monica Harden.
It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I thank the member who brought this debate, and I thank those who signed the petition today. And I'd like to point out, amongst other members, the unintended consequences of this policy, which are affecting my constituents in Esher and Walton. And for context, in Surrey, there are independent schools are serving around 20% of pupils. Firstly, I'm concerned that this government's policy will put at risk the many valued partnerships between state and independent schools that work so well in my constituency. In Easham Walton, the independent sector supports some of our state schools with capital projects like redecorating and renovating, and state primaries make use of independent school playing fields to open up sport and outdoor activities. I wish that there was more of this, and I was encouraging my independent schools to do more, but they now say that because of these VAT increases, this now becomes unaffordable. Secondly, I would like to also focus, alongside other members, on how this policy will impact the more than 40,000 pupils in Surrey who are receiving support for special educational needs. Madam Chair, Surrey's SEND system is in crisis. The 6 Liberal Democrat Surrey MPs have been shining a light on this fact ever since we were elected, even in meetings with the Schools Minister and the Education Secretary. However, this government policy is only putting more pressure onto an already strained, even broken system. And to understand this clearly, it's important to look first at the situation in Surrey, which the Honourable Member there alluded to, where there are more than 3,000 children in limbo awaiting diagnosis for autism and ADHD, many for almost 2 years. These are colossal waiting lists at a critical juncture in a child's education. As recently as last year, Surrey was delivering fewer than 1 in 6 EHCPs on time, and the quality of provision is so poor that even as I speak, over 1,800 children are missing at least a third of school days because their needs are not being met. In despair, parents are turning to the independent sector, knowing that their child is unable to access education, sliding critically into poor mental health. These are not rich families, but families in desperation, who can't watch their children unhappy and unattaining. And as one of the honourable members pointed out, it is often just simply the smaller class sizes for an autistic child or with a child who has ADHD. So the government's position is that local authorities will be able to reclaim the VAT on fees for pupils within the HCP who are attending the independent school named in their plan, but this leaves a critical blind spot. Almost 30,000 children are receiving SEND support without any HCP, and for them it is increasingly difficult for strained state schools to provide adequate provision. Following a lack of appropriate funding to schools by previous governments, real terms funding per pupil has only just in the past year reached the same level it did in 2009. When one factors the drop in capital spending on schools in the last 15 years, and that the costs for schools have risen faster than the overall level of inflation, we are faced with the bleak reality that there is significantly more pressure on state school budgets than there was 15 years ago. Therefore, we are seeing the interaction of ballooning costs for state schools with rising demand for SEND support, which, even excluding EHCPs, has risen by 50% in the last decade. Schools are therefore being asked to do more with fewer resources, and while this policy may be intended to give schools more money, my understanding is that none of this will go to better further educational needs provision. Indeed, the £1 billion that was put aside in the budget doesn't even touch the size of the £4.5 billion overspend in local authority budgets on special educational needs, let alone the ballooning costs of special educational needs provision. And third, at this particularly challenging moment for our economy, the government has chosen to place further burdens on families. Independent schools have risen by 13%, a surge in cost so severe that it has, amongst other factors, powered an uptick in inflation across the entire economy. This is due to the addition of fees and the decision of many schools not to absorb any of the costs, but rather to pass them along almost entirely to families. So for many hard-working parents then, however, sending a child to an independent school has been made more unaffordable, particularly hurting families with SEND children who are looking for an alternative to Surrey's failing system. They risk placing more financial strain on families at a time when the pain of inflation is still being felt, harming the mutually beneficial partnerships of state and independent schools, and risk more children languishing in a SEND system that is failed. And to finish, no head teacher that I have met who complains about this strain on their budgets on SEN ever asked for the private sector to pay. They asked for the radical overhaul in education that your government promised but is yet to deliver. Thank you.
Jack Rankin.
Thank you, It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. In Windsor, we are very lucky, and I am proud to represent some of the finest state and independent schools in this country. One has already been mentioned. It's very prominent, but it's not really that reflective of the situation in my constituency. You see, in my 2 errands that I ran, constituency visits this morning before I came into Parliament, I just counted the independent schools I passed. I passed 6, because 23% of the pupils in my constituency attend independent schools. And that caricature that my right honourable friend, the member for East Hampshire, mentioned was always in the papers when independent schools are discussed, does not reflect 23% of the parents in my constituency. Very often, recently, in my surgery years, I had parents there who are really struggling with this proposed policy. Their parents, often both working. One of the parents has often taken on a second job. They've remortgaged the house in many instances. They've gone without. And frankly, in many instances, sometimes their marriages are under pressure. And I'm concerned about their parents, those parents and those children. But because we've got such a high percentage of independent schools in my constituency, that means it's not just them that are affected, even though they might be most directly affected. The displaced children hit my state schools. And that means that it's our state sector that is bracing for an influx of children that they will struggle to accommodate. And that's why I think this is a false choice. It shouldn't be state versus independent. Our schools are an ecosystem, and they are all valuable. Because after all, education is a public good. It provokes social mobility, it strengthens our economy, and it benefits society at large. No other country in the world tries to tax it. And when they have tried, as in Greece, where it only lasted for 4 months, it massively backfired. In fact, many developed countries actually look to subsidise independent education to promote parental choice and drive up school standards. So in this way, the government is unique. Unique in its policy and, frankly, unique in its vindictiveness. And whenever Labour hikes taxes, there are unintended consequences. Just as their jobs tax is hitting charities and hospices, so too their tax on independent schools will hit military families and 130,000 pupils with SEND needs currently in independent schools. Of the parents I've spoken to, many use these schools as a way of giving their children that extra bit of support they would otherwise struggle to find in the state system. I would have thought that every single member of this House will recognise the challenges facing all their local authorities when it comes to SEND provision. Particularly from my involvement with the Down syndrome APPG, which my right honourable friend chairs, it's clear that getting an EHCP is already an uphill struggle. And taxing independent schools will create the most regressive possible outcome. It will add pressures already facing our local authorities, and it is the SEND children in the existing state provision who will pay the highest price. In a similar vein, and this was discussed by my honourable colleague for Surrey Heath, there are 2,666 military families in this country that rely on independent schools to give their children a stable education. For these families, VAT relief can make all the difference. I previously co-signed a letter sent to the Chancellor by my honourable friend for Solihull West and Shirley, calling on the government to protect military families making use of the continuity of education allowance from VAT. Although the Chancellor committed to re-rating CEA, I maintain that the full exemption from VAT is needed to truly support military families. I know this would make a real difference to those enlisted at either of Windsor's 2 great garrisons, to whom we owe so much to. This support should be given special consideration in the light of the Prime Minister's discussions over the weekend in the House today. Frontbenchers of the party opposite frequently refer to parents paying for independent education enjoying a tax break. But parents are actually saving the state £8,210, the money it costs to educate a child in the state sector, and receiving no compensation for the income taxes that they pay. In my book, that is no tax break at all. Frankly, the numbers just do not add up.
The Adam Smith Institute estimated that even in 10% of children move into the state sector, and anecdotally in my constituency I'm seeing higher than that, any revenue will be nullified. Any more than that 10%, and the policy will actually cost taxpayers money. This, in my view, highlights the ideology behind this decision. In my view, the party opposite are playing politics with children's futures. They are forcing families to have difficult conversations mid-year and make tough decisions. And the saddest conversations I've had with parents are parents who felt the need to separate children from classes mid-year. Frankly, only a Labour government could set out with the aim of improving education in this country and introduce policies that have led to 40 school closures since the budget. Ironically... Yes, sir.
I thank you for he is talking with a great understanding about the schools in this constituency, including state and independent, which is fantastic to hear. But we've heard in this debate about full state schools in England. We've heard about overloaded schools. We've heard about underfunded schools. He will acknowledge that funding had to be found somewhere to try to fix these problems. This is one solution. Is there an alternative?
Well, my point is that this won't raise any money.
It exacerbates the problem.
It exacerbates the problem because if 10% of the students are displaced, then that nullifies the revenue. And one thing that hasn't been mentioned, I think everybody's local authorities in this House are under some kind of financial strain. In the Royal Borough of Windsor, Maidenhead, more so than others. One of the biggest exploding bills that they've got on their books is the home-to-school transport budget. Yeah. So if you create a pressure unexpectedly in the system and expect the local authorities to pay this, then that's another emerging pressure for local authorities. Is that in the numbers? I don't know. Maybe the Minister could comment. What I find even humorous, really, is it's not often on this side of the House that we agree with teachers' unions, right? But even some of the teachers' unions are raising concern about the impact of this policy on staff and pupils in state schools. After only a few months, we are seeing pupils being taken out of private school at 3 times the previous rate. We will have to wait until September to see the full extent of this damage caused, as many parents will be doing everything they can to ensure that they wait till the end of the school year before taking their children, sadly, out of the schools which they have loved. In this country, we should be aiming to set the highest standards across the board, using schools that excel in both the independent and state sector as examples of what can be achieved. Labour would rather cut down this aspiration in return for uniformity. We are also seeing this attack in their dismantling of the academy system that have blossomed under successive governments of all colours. And far from guiding the invisible hand, Labour's education policy is strangling the school system. I reject this politics of envy policy wholeheartedly. It places politics above children, families and the good of the country. But if the government is determined to stick with it, I would urge them to introduce full exemptions for all SEND children, for military families and any specialist schools. Thank you very much, Mrs. Chairman.
It's a joy to speak under your chairmanship. I'm going to be brief because Tracy was on the agenda. I grew up as the eldest of 4 children and the only girl. My brothers and I were all grateful recipients of scholarships and bursaries to attend public schools. I am, believe it or not, a Cheltenham lady, and my brothers all attended King's Canterbury. 2 of my brothers served in His Majesty's Armed Forces, Johnny as a half-colonel in the Grenadier Guards, and Ben still serves as a brigadier in what we still refer to as the Black Watch. My other brother, James, worked as a heart surgeon before serving his community in Wales as a GP. In my own small way, I've tried to contribute to my country and my community, serving now as an MP, also as a town and district councillor, working for international and national NGOs, the National Farmers Union and the Environment Agency. All of this was made possible for all of us, in large part because of the education that we were fortunate enough to receive. As you can imagine, with a background like that, I very often get asked by people who tend to put their cross in the blue team box why I am a Liberal. And my answer is this: I am a Liberal because I was very well educated and I have a conscience. As As a Liberal, individual choice is part of my political DNA. That is why I am resistant of any attempts to erode choice, and so steps taken to remove parental choice over where and how children receive their education, to my mind, is politically indigestible. Ultimately, parental agency must come first in any discussion over one's children in their future. It should not be for the state to disrupt this dynamic. One is that most of those people, there are a few misconceptions in relation to private schools in this country. One is that most of those who are fortunate enough to attend independent schools are somehow part of the elites of this country. Many of these students in these schools up and down the country hail from backgrounds whose families have saved and made many a sacrifice in order to strive to provide the best possible education that they can for their children. My own parents were both teachers, not particularly high-paid professions. This policy would overturn a long-established VAT exemption on independent schools and would hit hard-working families the most. These schools would be forced to increase fees to stay afloat, cutting off the opportunity for many children and driving the further balkanisation of our education system, in which only the most financially fortunate would be able to afford private school fees.
Would the honourable member
I will.
give way? Thank you very much, Mrs. Llewellyn-Buck, and I thank my honourable friend for giving way. The government's policy will harm SEND children currently enrolled in independent schools. One constituent has written to me to say that their daughter, who goes to a local independent school, is there because of her autism, putting her into an environment best suited for her needs. Does the honourable member agree with me that the Minister should recognise the potential detrimental effect that children with SEND will face if the VAT exemption causes schools to cut scholarships and bursaries?
I thank my honourable friend for his interesting and adept intervention. I will be coming to that matter in a minute, and I'm afraid to say I will have just to let you know some shocking statistics from the Conservative Party in Devon. So back to where I was. Not to mention that this would, of course, also increase the strain immeasurably on a state school system which is already bursting at the seams, with a large influx of pupils transferring across to comprehensive schools. This tax would not offset that impact. Moreover, many pupils at these private schools are there because bursaries and scholarships have enabled them to be there, like myself. Let's take as an example Blunders School, the independent school in my constituency of Tiverton and Minehead. It has a proud reputation of offering a very high number of bursary places to disadvantaged children from low-income households who would otherwise not have the opportunity of a first-class education. It also opens its doors to the community who regularly make use of its wonderful facilities. This is the case for independent schools up and down the country. I think I referred to one earlier. And what about those pupils in need of extra support with their learning? And here comes the shocking statistic. Particularly given the shocking background of EHCP rollout across Devon, in which Conservative Devon County Council fails to meet its statutory duty of issuing EHCPs within a period of 20 weeks on 95% of occasions. 95%. I think we would all agree that that is shameful, even the Blue Team. And so, many parents whose pockets are not bottomlessly deep with children whose needs are not being met see independent schools as a means of securing the best possible future for their child. Who could possibly decry parents for doing such a thing? Mutter, mutter. Of course, it is my desire to see our state school system rise to the standards where parents would not feel as though independent schools are the only way for their children to receive a first-class education. I sincerely hope that day comes sooner rather than later, and I have confidence in this government that they will make that happen. But I cannot help but come back to choice, because it is the central premise of my argument, the choice of a parent to decide for themselves, and themselves alone, where their children learn. Thank you.
Ira Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mrs.
Buck, it's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. And can I thank the honourable member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk for introducing this debate and setting out the argument so eloquently, and of course to the almost 115,000 people who signed the petition, of whom 873 are in Twickenham. I actually just want to start with an apology to you and honourable members and people in the gallery if I seemed a little distracted over the last 45 minutes. I've just found out my daughter got her first choice of secondary school, state school, I should say, for this September. So I was a little distracted as all her class mates' parents were messaging to find out, and I was trying to communicate with my husband to let our daughter know that she will be going where she wants to go, so forgive me. But I thought it was quite appropriate to mention that, given that we are talking about schools, and indeed independent schools, and I'm very proud that my own borough of Richmond upon Thames has outstanding and secondary schools. In fact, all of them are outstanding and good, and we have some of the best primaries in the country, but that is not necessarily the case across the country. And I think it goes without saying that every person in this House, whatever party affiliation, we all hope and aspire for every child to receive an excellent education, and every child deserves the opportunity to reach their full potential. Yet too many children are not being supported to achieve that potential. Now, we Liberal Democrats believe in creating state schools that are so high-performing and provide a rich curriculum together with rich extracurricular options that parents don't feel compelled to send their children to the independent sector. And that's why we set out an ambitious education offer in our manifesto last year. We see education as an investment, not a cost. But as we all know far too well, and has been alluded to today, that is very far from the current reality of our state system. For too many children, our school system just isn't working. Too many are simply not getting the support they need and are entitled to, especially if they have additional needs. Teachers and other school staff, as well as school leaders, are struggling with ever tighter budgets, struggling to hire and keep the staff that they need, especially in maths and science, and they're struggling with crumbling school buildings and a SEND system that is utterly broken. So is it any wonder that many parents, for some of whom it is far from an easy financial decision, choose an independent education for their children? Because they want to invest in their children's future in the same way that I argue every day that the government should invest in our children. Yet it is in this context that the government has decided to tax independent schools and penalise families for making that choice. Now, we Liberal Democrats oppose the taxation of education as a principle, whatever form that education takes, whether it's tutoring, whether it's higher education, nursery fees or music lessons. Even more, we believe this measure is counterproductive. And since the policy has been announced, pupil movement out of the independent school sector has been 3 times higher than the government had predicted, with the fall being highest in transition years of Year 7 and reception at 4.6% and 3.9% respectively. Now, the Independent Schools Council survey last year found that there were already 10,000 fewer pupils in independent schools. And according to the ISC, this fall in numbers alone cost £92 million in state pupil funding. This cost is more than the government will raise from business rates on independent schools that are charities. Now, the majority of independent schools are small. 40% have fewer than 100 pupils. Now, with apologies to the honourable member for Windsor, we're not talking about the Eatons and the Harrows here. What I really struggle with in terms of this policy, and this has been alluded to by various honourable members, is it's not the very wealthy who will be impacted by it. Indeed, I have met some rather wealthy people who've said to me, and the Minister will be pleased to hear this, that they agree with the policy. But actually, they can afford it. They can absorb the extra cost. It is those parents, especially those who never set out deliberately to secure a private education for their children, but felt forced to do so for a variety of reasons, who are bearing the brunt and will be priced out. So the impact of Labour's policy is actually just making our private schools yet more elitist, which I think is what they're trying to, wage a campaign against. And I think the Right Honourable Member for East Hampshire actually made this very point.
And I want to just talk about two groups that have been particularly harmed by the government's policy, and other honourable members have touched on this also. The first is families of children with SEND. And as we've heard, there are almost 100,000 children with special needs in independent schools who don't have EHCPs. Under this government's policy, they are not exempt from VAT. Often parents of these children opt for private schools as a last resort when they have been continually failed by the state system and perhaps even rejected. This policy penalises parents for trying to do right by their children. One family in my constituency came to me at my surgery last year in tears when the policy was announced as going ahead and being implemented in January of this year. Their son was in a local state primary school, but he had become at risk of exclusion, primary school child, at risk of exclusion because of his challenging behaviour, which had manifested itself as a result of his additional needs, which the school could not support. So his parents made the very difficult decision to move him to a local private school, where he is now thriving. They are paying an extra £18,000 a year on top of the basic school fees for the additional support that he needs in that school to be able to learn and thrive. All of that, not just the basic fees, but the additional support fees, is subject to VAT under the government's policy. They do not know how they are going to meet the costs, but they knew that if he went back into the state sector, into the primary he was at, he would be at threat of being excluded. So I asked the Minister, why is the government punishing families such as these? Arguably, they've saved the taxpayer a lot of money, not just in terms of the child's schooling cost, but all the further knock-on costs we know result from a child being excluded from school. We all know that SEND provision in this country is utterly broken. Our local authorities and state schools are buckling under the demand, yet this policy threatens to place an ever greater burden on the state SEND system as parents are incentivised to battle the system for the EHCPs that many of these children probably could get if their parents tried hard enough, in order that they can secure the VAT exemption. And indeed, some parents of SEND children are simply being priced out of the independent sector back into state schools where these additional needs will need to be supported. Now, I've asked ministers to monitor and report to the House this particular aspect of the impact of the VAT policy. And so I ask the Minister again today if he will monitor and report on the impact on special needs for those children who don't have EHCPs and aren't exempt. Now, the second impacted group I wanted to briefly touch on is military families. Statistics from the Boarding Schools Association reveal that the government's new policy will have an adverse impact on military families using the Continuity of Education Allowance scheme. Now, under the scheme, parents must make a minimum 10% contribution to fees. But even with the Ministry of Defence's recalculation in response to the government's policy, parental contributions will have to increase by a further 18% on average, rising from £14,000 to £17,000 for a child in senior school. As my honourable friend, the member for Surrey Heath, has already pointed out, this will be unaffordable for many families and impact forces retention. Those serving our country should not be financially penalised for doing so, and we should endeavour to provide service families with continuity and stability. So I hope the Minister, alongside his colleagues in the Ministry of Defence, will make a clear statement of how the impact of VAT by this tax, choosing to prize numbers over human experience. I fear they are being driven by ideology. But Chair, I am perplexed as to why ministers have been hell-bent on this particular policy that hits parents' pockets directly, yet they have resisted my party's attempts to amend the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill to ensure that private equity companies that are profiteering from private special schools are not being subjected to the profit cap that this Labour government is imposing on children's homes and fostering agencies, often run by the same companies. And they are making eye-watering profits, margins of 20% plus that local authorities are having to pay. Yet the Labour government doesn't want to do anything about that, but it's attacking parents that want to send their kids to private schools. It makes no sense to me, and I hope the Minister will address that point. So I understand the fiscal situation right now is hard. My party laid out during the election, unlike the Labour Party, a whole host of areas where taxes could be raised fairly in order to invest in our children's education and our country's future. whether that's properly reforming capital gains tax, reversing the Conservatives' tax cuts for bankers, or increasing the tax on big tech companies. We are ambitious for every child, and we want to put a dedicated mental health professional in every primary and secondary school, expand free school meals for all children in poverty, and ensure those children who've fallen behind are supported through tutoring. That vision can be realised without penalising parents who are choosing to do what every parent naturally wants to do: invest in their children's education and future. Thank you.
Opposition spokesperson Neil O'Brien.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and we've had some superb speeches on all sides of the House today, starting with my honourable friend from Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk, who led us off brilliantly. I'd like to start by thanking the nearly 115,000 people who triggered this debate by signing the petition against the education tax, particularly those who are present here today. There is a good reason why all previous governments of all colours have avoided taxing education. It's very hard to imagine a Tony Blair government doing what this one is now doing. In fact, we know that he slapped the idea down hard when it was suggested. Likewise, Clement Attlee didn't do it, nor did Harold Wilson or Jim Callaghan. The rest of Europe don't do it. But under this government, schools are being hit by a triple whammy of VAT, business rates and higher national insurance too. And we know that even some government ministers have their doubts about this. The Chief Secretary to the Treasury, no less, told the girls at Redmaynes High School in 2022 that he opposed his party's policy on taxing independent schools, and that it wouldn't bring in what their own party were claiming. What an extraordinary thing for the Chief Secretary to have said. And as the Labour member for Ealing Central and Acton said, the government is doing exactly what it promised it would not do. This is raising tax on working people. Now, the government's claim is that it needs to find some money, and I note that the government is perfectly able to find billions and billions to fund its bizarre payment to Mauritius to take our own territory off of us. But even if I couldn't think of anywhere that the government could save some money, and I can, my advice would be, if you want to tax people who've got more money, then you should tax people who've got more money, rather than taxing education. The problem with taxing education is that it catches people who are not rich. You catch people who are sacrificing so much else to invest in education, something unselfish, which has wider social benefits. Now, if you wanted to tax fancy cars or fancy holidays or meals out or something, I would at least understand. But taxing investment in education is a mistake, and starting it halfway through a school year makes it worse and is vindictive. In my constituency on the edge of Leicester, we benefit from lots of different types of people, but we benefit in particular from second-generation communities who really, really value education. And I see whole extended families in my constituency coming together to spend what money they do have, not on fancy cars or luxuries, but on school. And in the biggest independent school in my constituency, Leicester Grammar, probably the most common occupation among the parents is to be a doctor working in the NHS. And being a doctor is still a very common dream for their pupils too. So education has these wider social benefits. And I'm very struck that the government praises these people one minute and then wallops them the next. One minute they love them, the next they hate them. And the other really common reason that my constituents end up paying twice over for education is that their child has some sort of special needs. So first they pay the tax, then they don't use the service that they paid for, and then they pay again themselves to get what they think is the right thing for their child. Because parents know what the ECHP system is like. They can see the ever-rising demand. So instead of adding to that demand, they pay up themselves out of their own pocket. And they're content to make sacrifices themselves to get the care they need for their child and their special needs. Independent schools educate more than 130,000 pupils with SEND, of which around about 100,000 don't have ECHPs. And this is going to be one of the big challenges created by the education tax. If a significant chunk, maybe not even a big chunk, of that 100,000 or so children with special needs but no ECHP are taxed into the state system, then that will be a huge new load on a special needs system that has already seen demand absolutely explode over recent years. And councils are already struggling, will have to do more assessments and find even greater resources. Now, we know that 100,000 figure from both the government's own data and the IC census. But behind every statistic is a real child. And there was an example recently of how this is playing out just over the border from us into Lincolnshire, where a girl was forced to move schools because her parents couldn't afford the new tax. And the council have now gone from paying nothing to spending £8,200 a year of taxpayers' money to transport her a long way to the nearest school that can take her. And some of these cases are profoundly sad. There was a report in The Independent recently about a girl who was hospitalised for 8 months last year with a rare brain condition, which left her needing a very high level of support and unable to cope with the change of school placement. The daughter had attended a private school, which her dad says they just about afforded, but the 20% charge on top made it unaffordable. And having been living in intensive care, once she came out, she had only 8 months left at her old school because she was in year 11. Her father raised her plight to the DfE, and he says of the letter back from ministers that, and I quote, "I could have smashed my head against a wall when I got that letter. I was so angry and upset. It's so heartless." Now, the government claims that this is a great and vital revenue raiser. In reality, this has always been highly uncertain. The rate at which it will shift pupils into state education is very hard to predict, and the effects of this large group of children with SEN moving makes it even more uncertain. Pupil movement out of independent schools is already 3 times higher than predicted, as has been noted in this debate. 10,000 fewer pupils are in independent schools already, according to the September 2024 ISC Pupil Numbers Survey, and the drop was largest in the transition years, with a drop of just over 4.5% in year 7 entrants. The government wants to present all the parents who end up sending their children to independent schools as incredibly wealthy. But according to a bit of analysis by Dermot McKenzie, around 90,000 families who use independent schools are on below average incomes. They will be the ones who are most affected, and independent schools will become more exclusive. The Honourable Member for Paisley and Renfrewshire North talked about the ability of schools to now, because of this change, reclaim historic VAT on capital spending. Now, that is worth about £5 million for Eton, but nothing at all for lots of smaller schools that are less well-resourced, and some of them are not well-resourced. I think of a small Christian school in Leicester who got in touch with me because they were so concerned about this. Their income per pupil is probably below the neighbouring state schools, their fees are low, the teachers could get paid a lot more elsewhere, and the parents are definitely not rich. Why do they do it? They do it because it's a labour of love. And it's a labour of love for others too. There's all kinds of reasons that children end up in the independent sector. Maybe it's their special needs, maybe it's faith, maybe it's to do with language, maybe it's a particular educational approach that works for their child. In a word, this is pluralism. On the other side of the ledger, what do we have to show for it? The government occasionally tries to claim that the money is ring-fenced for some purpose or another. But of course the truth is, as the Minister knows, there are no ring-fences at the Treasury. In the Troubled Schools Bill, we see measures that will unwind the educational reforms to state schools that propelled England up the international league tables. The Institute for Fiscal Studies says that over the last Parliament, per pupil spending in mainstream schools rose by about 11% between 2019 and 2024, when adjusted for inflation. So that's an 11% per pupil real terms increase. But for this coming year, the IFS have pointed out that state schools' costs are going up faster than their income, with costs up 3.6% and funding up only 2.8%. So it is not the case that the education tax is unlocking some great funding bonanza for those of us who have got our kids in state schools. In fact, I see that the NEU have recently relaunched their Stop School Cuts campaign. Now, there are 43 schools that have closed or announced closure since Labour came to power, and many of them have explicitly pointed to the education tax as the thing that tipped them over the edge. Schools which have closed include Hemdean House School, Abercorn School, Portland Place School, Riverhouse Montessori School, Alton School, Conifers School, Kilgraston School, the Study School, Ursuline Preparatory School, the Hampshire School, St Joseph's Preparatory School, Wing School, Argyle House, Chartfield School, Gracefield Preparatory School, Lawrence House, North London Steiner School, Redbourne Park Secondary School, Shealing School, the Copper Academy, the GFC School, the Preparatoria School, Ashcroft School, Downham Preparatory School, Life Wirral Sports Schools, Iona School, Bridgedorf Waldorf School, Progress Schools, Summit School, Chartfield School, Advanced Education, Tashbar Boys Nursery, Kilgraston School, St Joseph's Preparatory School in Stoke-on-Trent, Maidwell Hall near me in Northamptonshire, Loughborough Amherst School, Godolphin Prep in Salisbury, Village School for Girls in Camden, Highfield Prep in Maidenhead, Oxford House School in Colchester, Carradus School in Oxfordshire, Bedstone College in Buckwell, and Fairfield PNEU School in Blackwell. And schools that have merged and reduced in numbers include Headington School, Rice and Anthony, Orchard House, Chiswick in Bedford Park, Westbury House, and the Study School. And I read this out because, as well as the number of children who will move into the state sector and have their education disrupted in that way, which seems to be much higher than the government predicted, there's also a huge number of children that will have their education disrupted, even if they do end up in another independent school. And that is precisely what's happening to a lot of parents in my constituency at the moment because of local closures. Now, the government will say these children are privileged. I say they're children. And being forced to change schools and maybe separated from friends is disruptive and bad, whoever you are. The government has often countered that not many pupils will be affected. We hear about the small percentage of pupils who will move and how easy it will be for the state sector to accommodate them. We hear much less about how much extra that will cost. But we've heard nothing from the government about the 10,000 fewer children in independent schools I already mentioned. The official impact predictions for VAT estimated 3,000 pupils would leave this academic year. And now we've seen 10,000 in the first term. We have 5 months still to August, and it may get worse before the year is out. So if the number of pupils leaving the sector continued to run at 3 times the predicted levels, then you'd face not just 35,000 pupils displaced, just 35,000, but more than 100,000. And in many cases, they will struggle to get a state school place. At least 27 authorities are full in certain age cohorts. And since Labour announced this policy, pupil number projections in the state sector have been revised up nationally, and significantly so in many local authorities. Ms Lowbuck, this means that fewer people in the state system will get their first choice of school. And while there is uncertainty about the fiscal impact of this policy, there is no uncertainty that this is not the best way to raise revenue. The other day, the Chancellor announced that she was going to introduce a special new business film rate relief. So there will be a business rate relief for the film industry, even as the government takes away business rate relief for schools. And the argument is, oh, you know, this is good, this is an investment in our future. But schools are an investment in our future. And the argument is, you know, this is good culturally, this is part of our culture, but education is good for our culture as well. Madam Chairman, I'll come to an end here. There is uncertainty about the fiscal impact of this, but there is no uncertainty that this is causing a lot of misery for parents with special needs kids, for parents who don't want to have their kids' education disrupted. The government are doing this for political reasons. The thing there is no doubt about is that this is not the best way to raise revenue. This is a purely political decision, and it's having significant, real-world bad effects on our constituents right across this country.
Minister.
Thank you, Mrs Lewell-Buck. It's a pleasure to serve under you today, and to do so in this debate, secured not by an honourable member, as is often the case, but by public petitioners, including some with us here today. And public attention on issue is very good grounds for it being debated. I also want to thank the honourable member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk for introducing this session and for closing it shortly, and to all those who have spoken during it. There is lots that is not common ground on this issue, as I will come on to, but I should start by noting that all of us are motivated by the same determination to support the aspirations of every parent in the UK to get the best education for their children. In that context, we should all congratulate the member for Twickenham on her good news, and also agree with the comments by the member for Ealing Central and Acton that we all know people who have made a wide range of decisions about the educational choices for their children, and no one during this session is judging other parents' choices. But this is all that the best education for children is also what motivates the government to break down barriers to opportunity, ensuring every child has access to high-quality education. Every child includes the 94% of children that attend state schools. The reforms we debate today to VAT and business rates will raise around £1.8 billion a year, and I will come on to the questions raised about the costing shortly. And that will help to improve state education. In the autumn budget, the government announced a £2.3 billion increase to the core schools budget, and it is to deliver commitments like that, not for any other purpose, that we have made the tough but necessary decisions we debate today. The member for Harbour just called for even larger increases in spending on schools, but noteworthy did not set out the means in which that should be paid for. Now, Madam Chair, I will briefly outline the policy changes the government is making before turning to the important issues honourable members have raised during this debate. Since the 1st of January, education services provided by private schools have been subject to VAT. Whilst private schools are now required to charge VAT, they are also, as we have discussed, able to recover that VAT that they incur when purchasing goods and services. The government is also legislating to remove the eligibility for charitable rate relief from private schools that are charities in England. This is intended to take effect from April, is already the case in Scotland, and is being taken forward in Wales. As I said, the goal of these changes is to provide additional funding for the state education sector. But I fully recognise that they will increase the cost for some parents and carers who have chosen a private education for their children. This change is necessary, but I am not hiding from the reality that any rise is unwelcome for those affected by it. Of course.
So we clear whether this is going to raise any money, but I want to understand the policy point here, that to raise the money to fund the state sector, the government has decided to raise tax on the independent education sector. Why did they decide to raise money from the education sector rather than from any other sector or any other richer individuals?
Thank the honourable member for his intervention. I might be a little bit more sympathetic to the focus on this if I saw members on the other side of this House supporting any of the revenue measures that we've had to take to start turning around public services into improving the public finances. They oppose this measure, they oppose changes on national insurance, they oppose cuts to the winter fuel payment and the rest. Now, I'll make some progress. On the timing of implementation, as the Honourable Member for Paisley and Renfrewshire North pointed out, this was clearly signposted in Labour's manifesto. And HMRC is working hard to support schools through this change, providing bespoke support to schools alongside comprehensive guidance on how schools register for VAT. And a dedicated mailbox for queries has also been made available to schools and to their tax representatives. Now, several honourable members have raised the impacts these changes will have on pupils and their families, and on state and private schools more widely. Many interventions have understandably returned to questions that were addressed in the Tax Impact and Information Note or to the Government's response to the consultation conducted between July and September this year. On the costings raised by Honourable Member for Boston and Skegness, the underlying methodology used were certified by the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility, and the costing takes into account the exact issues that he raises about behavioural responses. On the questions of pupils moving schools or sectors, we recognise that some of this will take place. However, we believe the number of students who will switch to the state sector represents less than 0.5% of all UK state pupils. So we are confident that the state sector will be able to accommodate any change. On schools themselves, the member for Farnham and Gordon raised the question of closures. The evidence suggests that around 50 private schools close each year in normal business. While we would expect some additional closures, we have not seen any evidence to revise our view that the overall numbers will be modest, perhaps something of the order of magnitude of 100 schools over 3 years. Now, Chair, we also recognise the concerns that have been raised about the impact on pupils with special educational needs, including by the member for South West Hertfordshire. That is why we will ensure those with the most acute additional needs, where those can only be met in the private schools, are unaffected. For example, in England, where attendance at that private school is required by a child's EHCP, those children's parents and carers will not pay VAT. Councils supporting them will be able to reclaim the VAT. In Wales, post-16 provision of this kind is funded by the Welsh Government rather than councils, who cannot reclaim VAT in the same way. So ring-fence funding will be provided until 28-29, when responsibility will pass to local authorities. More broadly, we are committed to transforming the system of supporting children and young people with SEND, because it is badly needed, as the members for Esher and Walton, plus Tiverton and Minehead, set out clearly. The budget announced a £1 billion uplift to high needs funding in 25-26, providing additional support for more than 1 million children in the state sector with special educational needs and disability. The members for Surrey Heath and Windsor raised the question of service families, but I fear they downplayed the increase in the continuity of educational allowance from the MOD of over 12%. Faith schools has also been raised, and they're an important part of our educational landscape, but the argument that private faith schools should be exempt from these changes is not compelling. An exemption would reduce the revenue available for pupils in state schools, including those of faith, and it is inconsistent with this government's strong view that a state education is suitable for children of all faiths and none. Chair, of course, sir.
On the question of faith-based education, it's quite right. Very large numbers of faith-based schools in the state sector, but there are some denominations for which there are not. Some particular religious traditions for which there are not, which have schools that actually subcharge fees which are sometimes considerably below the average case of a state place. And would he recognise that there may be a case for an exemption in those cases?
Great point.
I thank the right member for his intervention. I recognise the description of the status quo as he describes it, but I would only reiterate my view and the government's view that a state education is suitable for all families of all faiths. Now, Madam Chair, a public petition has decided we should have today's debate, and on that grounds alone it is right that we have had it. I recognise many of the points that honourable members have raised, even if I have attempted to set out why the government believes that in some cases they are overdone. But as we rightly debate the impact of these policies, we must recognise the reason that they have been made. The priority that we must attach to providing extra resources to our state schools, resources that I have not heard huge suggestions for replacing today. Schools where 94% of our children are educated, and where this government will deliver an education system fit for all. Thank you very much, Chair.
John Lamont to wind up.
Thank you very much, Mrs Lewell. I'm conscious of the time. In fact, I think the House of Commons is about to vote, so I will not detain colleagues for longer. Can I just start by thanking, first of all, the petitioner again for bringing forward this petition, and for everybody, the 115,000 people who bothered to sign the petition, and to all colleagues who contributed to this important debate. I think it's telling that the vast majority of honourable members spoke against this government policy, the position of the VAT charge on school fees, and also the removal of the business rates relief. It's also very telling, I think, in terms of the empty benches opposite. We have very notable exceptions in terms of the honourable members opposite who did come to try to defend their colleagues' the Labour government's policy, although, again, it was interesting to hear some of the caution that was also being expressed, most notably for the member for Ealing Central and Acton, who gave a very important contribution. I was struck, I think, from all the contributions, just in terms of the impact this policy is going to have on those young people with additional needs, and the fact it's not about simply wealthy families choosing to send their children to independent schools. There are lots of young people who need to go to the independent sector to get the support and the educational support they need to get them to a point in their life where they're able to achieve their full potential. And that option, that opportunity is going to be deprived to many of them because of this policy. We've also heard from a number of colleagues about the impact on military families, and that certainly is not something I previously considered. I am deeply disappointed with the government's responses. I'm sure all the petitioners are as well. No recognition that there might need to be a review of this policy in the future in terms of how it's going to impact on the independent sector and impact on the opportunities that young people are going to have. Again, thank you to Hugh, the petitioner. One of the highlights today was meeting Amelia, Hugh's daughter, who is here today in the gallery. I hope Amelia has enjoyed this debate and found it interesting, although I suspect the purchase of the House of Commons teddy bear before the debate started will be the high point for Amelia. But thank you again to all colleagues. Thank you.
Yeah, well done.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 701-268 relating to VAT on independent school fees and business rates relief for independent schools. As many are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.